By now, the story is already well known. At least 8 people across the U.S. have died, and more than 100 have contracted a fungal form of meningitis from epidural injections of tainted methylprednisolone acetate, produced by the New England Compounding Center. While the FDA and CDC are currently focused on controlling and limiting the outbreak, before long, the focus will rightly return to determining its cause. That means not just investigating how the fungus got into the drug supply, but also whether the FDA needs greater authority and resources to regulate the billion-dollar compounding industry. The FDA has always asserted its authority to regulate compounding, but court decisions leave the question muddled. The FDA's position is that compounded drugs are in fact new drugs and therefore subject to its regulation. Still, by most accounts, monitoring of compounding falls under the jurisdiction of typically underfunded state pharmacy boards, and the FDA's enforcement efforts have been scattershot at best. To be sure, the FDA has issued warning letters and taken enforcement actions against compounding pharmacies. In 2010, FDA issued 10 warning letters, mostly focused on misbranding and false medical claims, but also citing compounding pharmacies for not maintaining sterile conditions and marketing drugs for unapproved uses. Since 2010, however, the FDA hasn't focused much on compounding. Last year, for example, the agency refused to step in and prohibit pharmacies from compounding an inexpensive alternative to KV Pharma's high-priced orphan drug Makena. That's not the only reason pharma should be troubled. The tainted epidural injections were off-label and appear to compete directly with Pfizer's Depomedrol as well as a few generic alternatives. More significantly, the size and scale of NECC's operation is likely to give pharma companies pause. NECC shipped some 17,000 vials to 76 facilities in 23 states since May. That hardly looks like the traditional model of pharmacists compounding uniquely individualized medications for specific patients. And the FDA specifically prohibits compounders from using commercial-scale equipment, but really the question is whether some operations are using compounding as a loophole to avoid oversight in FDA's stringent manufacturing regulations. Pharma has invested heavily in ensuring manufacturing excellence. The question is whether compounding pharmacies should be held to the same standard. It's not as though the pharmacy industry hasn't had the opportunity to clean up its act. As I reported in 2007, leading industry groups created the Pharmacy Compounding Accreditation Board to establish standards and ensure quality. Ken Baker, PCAB's executive director at that time, told me that 100 pharmacies were going through the process in 2007. Now, 5 years later, that number stands at 162 accredited pharmacies out of more than 3,000 compounding pharmacies in the U.S., just a drop in the bucket. Already, calls are starting to emerge for greater FDA oversight of compounding, but unlike in previous cases of accidental deaths from compounding mistakes, the nationwide scope and size of this outbreak are likely to fuel a real push for greater clarity and responsibility for the FDA in regulating compounded medications.